Welcome to AppStories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is a very special bonus episode of AppStories, all about Federico's iOS and iPadOS 13 review. Welcome to AppStories, Federico.
Hi, John. How are you?
Good. You're not a guest, but I felt like I had to welcome you because you've been gone for a while. It's been a long summer, and you've been, camped out at the beach and other places, working on your review all summer. And we're recording this just a couple of days before it actually goes out, and we're going to release it alongside the review. But it's been a long haul, and how are you feeling about it? A couple of days before it actually goes out.
It's impossible to tell right now whether it'll be well received or not. I'm at the stage where I'm completing my final seventh read of the review, and it feels like I've been reading this thing forever. It feels like 2 years ago that I was at the beach and trying to get some writing done. I have no idea if people will like it or not. You work on something long enough, by the end of the process, you sort of start to hate what you've done.
Yes, I know how that is.
But in looking at the review on the site and, doing my tests and all of that, I was looking at the complete structure of the review and the table of contents and the graphics and the animations, and it looks really good. And I realized, I made something that I'm very happy with. I think it's the best thing I've ever done. But then again, I always say that, and maybe that's a good sign. But I'm looking at it right now. I'm very happy with what I see. I'm very happy with the topics that I covered, and it took a lot of work, but I'm happy with what I've created. Now, of course, will readers be happy as well? Will they be satisfied? I have no idea of knowing, but I know that I've poured myself and over 3 months of my life into this, and I couldn't do any more than this. I could have done less, but I wouldn't have been happy. So this is all I was able to do, nothing more than this, and we'll see how it goes, I guess.
Well, I'll tell you, I think it is absolutely your best work. I've been through 3 of these processes with you over the years, and actually 4, if I think about it, 2016 through 2019. Yeah, 4. And yeah, I think it's fantastic. We're going to dive into it, but there's so much that goes into your review besides just the review at this point. I mean, what used to be just Federico publishes his review has become not just a big day on the site, but a weeks long type of thing. Because when you combine this kind of with what we've been doing with the club and all the ancillary stuff that goes along with this, there's a lot going on, and we've got lots and lots of extras and bonus content and other things going on. This episode of AppStories included, that are surrounding the release of the review. Do you want to maybe walk through a quick rundown of that before we kick it off and talk about the review a little bit?
Sure. So for Club MacStories members, there's a lot of extras that you can unlock today and later this week, and only Club members can get access to this extra content. So, of course, there's an ebook version that weighs about 400 megabytes, and it's only available for free for to Club MacStories members, whether you're paying monthly or annually. You can look in the download section of your profile at macstories.memberful.com, and you will find the ebook that you can download. And the ebook is the best way to read the review offline, because it tries to, as much as possible within the limitations of the EPUB format, we tried to replicate the design of the website. And so you will find image galleries, you will find screenshots and videos that do not require an internet connection. And you will find the asides and the footnotes and the new info boxes, which are a new formatting element new to the review this year on MacStories.net. So the ebook is, I think, the best way to read the review offline, make notes, highlight the things that you like or that you want to remember for later. And, from a reference point of view, I think it's the best format to enjoy the review and keep it in your collection for later. Club MacStories members can also get access today to new and exclusive MacStories wallpapers that we commissioned, and that there's a lot of different versions, with and without the MacStories logo, with different colors, with different Johnny Ive and Scott Forstall textures.
Yes.
There's some very pretty gradient wallpapers that you can see throughout the review in some of my screenshots, and those are also available today for Club MacStories members. There's a members-only episode of our special podcast called MacStories Unplugged, which is another Club MacStories exclusive, also available today, where John and I dig deeper into the behind the scenes and making of my review, and where we also interview Brian King, who's the professional animator and graphic designer that worked on the animations and cover images, all the special graphics for the review. So all those images that you can see in the table of contents throughout the chapters, and the special intro animation and all the other animations throughout the review, Brian worked on that. So we discuss the process and the tools that Brian used in an episode of MacStories Unplugged. There's more. In MacStories Weekly, which is our newsletter that usually comes out on Fridays, it's going to come out on Saturday this week. We need an extra day to make sure that we get, all the content lined up. You will also find a written version of my making of and behind the scenes, as well as exclusive advanced shortcuts that I created for the review that are demonstrated in the review with videos and screenshots, but which are marked as Club MacStories exclusives. So those links to download those shortcuts alongside explanations for those shortcuts will be released in MacStories Weekly, where you will also find my making of and more details and and stats for the review, but also another guest article from Brian King with screenshots and explanations and commentary around his setup with Cinema 4D and all the crazy stuff he's been doing for the graphics and the animations. And I think that's all.
Oh, I think you actually missed two things.
Oh man.
There's so much.
Yes, I did. I did miss things.
You did. There's a second ebook, which is, if you've been following along throughout the summer, the MacStories team did a whole series of articles previewing iOS 13. There are a total of 9 of them, and those have been collected into a separate ebook. And when you put that together with Federico's, it's well over 100,000 words, which is just bananas to me. I mean, and it's pretty lengthy in its own right, but it's nothing like Federico's review. And then we're going to do a second episode of MacStories Unplugged that's going to come out next week. That's going to be about some of our favorite apps from the perspective of the apps that have done a really good job implementing various features of iOS 13. So it's a lot, and it's all coming. And if you're a club member, keep an eye out on Weekly for all the details. We'll also have a post on the website that you can follow things through and all that. And if you want to join, there'll be links in there too to join the club. All right, Federico, we need to start talking about this review. Where do you think we should start? I want to start with kind of the big picture, the themes, because, in the past, a lot of these releases, these iOS releases, have had a very specific feel or theme to them, where it was one particular area that was focused on, whether that, was the share sheet or design or something like that. What was that the case this year? I mean, what are some of the big picture things that you noticed in going through iOS in such detail?
Yeah, this is something that I try to do every year when I review a new version of iOS. I try to find sort of the driving theme behind the new iOS release. And so in iOS 7, you could see the design, of course, and in iOS 8, it was all about extensions and, for developers, Swift. In iOS 9, split view and iPad multitasking and so forth. And I try to find a theme, the biggest idea that sort of makes the new version of iOS special and sort of gives it a unique nature. But I also think that Apple tries to do the same. And the more I tried to find the single recurring major theme of iOS 13 and iPadOS 13, the more I realized there wasn't a single theme, but it was more of a collection of ideas and multiple themes that make iOS 13 a very different release. And I think part of the part of the conversation here is the fact that iOS 13 is just a massive release from a software perspective. From a feature perspective, it's got so many updated apps. You have, a major redesign of reminders and updates to photos and essentially an all-new Safari for iPad, updates to files, and a new iPadOS. There's so much in iOS 13 that it was impossible for me to come up with a single theme that would characterize this release. And I also think part of the problem here is that Apple, of course, doesn't explicitly mention this, but it's very clear that some of these features were supposed to come out last year.
Right.
And they were delayed to, because Apple needed to focus on with iOS 12 on stability and improving battery life and polishing the OS, following all the criticism surrounding the fact that iOS had become bloated and there was the whole performance and battery debacle from Christmas 2017. So Apple needed to focus on different aspects of the OS, and many features were apparently delayed. And all of those features, including a major update to shortcuts, have made it into iOS 13. And in addition to that, Apple also decided to split iOS in two, with iOS for iPhone and iPod Touch and iPadOS for iPads. And so when I found myself outlining the review and trying to, sitting down and thinking, what is the single theme behind this release? I realized I could pick one. And maybe you could say, well, the theme itself is the fact that iOS is a major release and it's now splitting itself in two. But it wouldn't do justice to all the other concepts and ideas that you can find in this release. And so you have a theme that I try to elaborate on and provide multiple examples for in the review is how Apple is freely borrowing at this point features from the Mac and adapting them to iOS, to the iPhone, and to the iPad, and rethinking them in the process. So either simplifying them or changing how they're supposed to work. Those are features that are very obviously coming from macOS, but they've been remixed for iOS and iPadOS. And so you look at one obvious example would be the column view in files for iPad, how it's sort of reminiscent of column view from the Finder on macOS, but it behaves in a slightly different way. Or the download manager for Safari. It looks like a traditional Safari download manager, but it's got the unique twist of being integrated with files and file provider extensions in iOS. So you can download files and you can save them to iCloud Drive and files, but you can also choose to make any other file provider, whether it's Dropbox or Working Copy, the default location for your downloads. Or you look at something like shortcuts, how it's adopting some of the features that are traditionally reserved for programming. How you deal with parameters and variable generation, but how those features are being rethought for iOS and for shortcuts' unique environment. And so this idea of it's inspired by the Mac, but it's being rethought for multi-touch and for iOS and iPadOS. That's one of the key concepts from the review.
Yeah, I found that really interesting when you got into it. And I do think too that it can't be understated how big this release is in terms of its scope, because when you look back, it's as you said, when you look back at each of these past updates to iOS, they had a certain angle, whether it was design or the share sheet or whatever it was. But literally everything has been touched in this release. And I do think a lot of it has to do with maybe things that were deferred until 13 from 12. Because when you look at what we got last year, all you have to do is really kind of put your reviews side by side, and you can see the stark contrast. Last year was a release that very much was about stability and performance, whereas now it's a lot more fundamental than that. And the thing about the Mac inspiration that I think is the key to what you put your finger on is that it's inspiration, not copying, in the sense that the features that have been brought over, they're problems that have been solved for a very long time on a different platform, but they're brought over and adapted to touch in a way that makes sense for the device you're using instead of just wholesale bringing them over exactly the way they are on the Mac, for instance, right?
Yeah, I agree. Like for example, you look at something like support for external USB drives in files,
right?
And it's very much a feature that's being quote unquote copied from the Mac, but it's been entirely re-engineered so that support for external drives has been brought to iOS, and it's been brought to the user space of the file system, and that not only allows files to access external drives securely and to make sure that external accessories do not have access to other areas of the file system, but also Apple was able to rewrite it so that on an iPad running iPadOS, you can unplug any USB drive without having to eject it first. And that's just one of the many instances of Apple saying we can take this feature that users have come to expect from a modern computer, and we can bring it to iOS and iPadOS, but we do not necessarily have to copy the design and the exact way that it works on macOS. So I think that is definitely one of the themes that I try to provide multiple cases, multiple examples for. And the other, I think, is the idea that iOS as a whole, and by which I mean also iPadOS as part of that, is no longer just the operating system for the iPhone. iOS, which used to be called iPhone OS before version 4,
right?
It was primarily intended as the operating system for the iPhone. But as time has gone on, we have seen watchOS and tvOS being developed using iOS as a foundation. And I think more than ever with iOS 13, we can see how Apple is treating iOS as an underlying platform. And with the release of iPadOS, that story is now complete in the sense that iOS is the underlying foundation that has allowed Apple to make an Apple Watch, to release a new software for the Apple TV, to develop software specifically for cars with CarPlay, and to have a version of that also works with smart speakers, with the HomePod and Audio OS, which is also based on iOS. And now iOS is becoming the foundation for iPadOS, which is still very much based on iOS. And some people will say, well, it's just a marketing thing. But I think it's another example of how iOS is the platform, is the foundation at the bottom of which Apple can build other experiences, other types of devices, other types of products. And I think that is very much one of the recurring themes of this year's review of how, yes, iOS is the new operating system for the iPhone, but it's also the technical foundation, the stable foundation upon which Apple can build other things, sort of like how 10 years ago, or actually 12, Mac OS X was the stable technological foundation upon which Apple built the iPhone. And I think now it's sort of the opposite. The operating system for the iPhone is so advanced and so modern and high performance and stable and secure that Apple can use it as a foundation for other things.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I really like your point in the review about the balance between iOS and iPadOS too, because yes, you can view these things, you can view iPadOS today as a marketing term, and you can look at the two, and they're very similar. However, what we've really seen since iOS 11 is a greater willingness by Apple to start deviating and going out on a different path with the iPad that wasn't there, 3 or 4 years ago. And so I think both the name is appropriate because of that evolution of how the iPad operating system works, but also as a starting point to really tell the world this is something different now. This is more than just the computer in your pocket. This is also potentially your only computing device, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this idea of we need to stop thinking of iOS and the iPhone as sort of like an afterthought and sort of like mini versions of what Apple did on the Mac before, that was the mindset of 10 years ago, even more, when the real computing, quote unquote, real computing happened on the Mac, and on the iPhone, you had mini versions of apps or smaller versions of apps. The situation is very much reversed today in that the real experiences happen on iOS and iPhone and the iPad, and they're later brought to the Mac. And I mean, the fact that you have, for example, shortcuts and this entirely new automation framework on iOS, and that is still not available in macOS Catalina, gives you an idea. Or, for example, the fact that Apple is now convincing developers to bring iPad apps to the Mac with Catalyst shows you how it's the complete opposite of the last decade. The new generation of Apple software is iOS at the center and everything else around it, including the Mac. So this idea of iOS is no longer just a collection of apps, there's a new Photos app, there's a new Reminders app, which is very much true, but it's more than that. It's the all-encompassing platform that has repercussions for other types of devices, from the Apple Watch and iPad to the car, and in a way, the Mac. So with that, of course, comes my, the challenging part of my job, and which was the real challenge of this review. How do you review something that is not just an operating system, a collection of apps anymore, but really the single platform upon which a company is building all kinds of other devices? It's really challenging. And it's a lot of work.
Yeah, I totally get where you're coming from with that. I mean, I know my Catalina review will come out in the future. We don't sometime in October, as Apple has told me. And one thing I noticed in working on that is kind of maybe the flip side of what you experienced, in that I'm writing it knowing about everything that's going on over here on the side with iPadOS and iOS 13, and realizing that there's more overlap than there ever has been. And it's not just about the 4 original Catalyst apps that came over to the Mac. It's about all sorts of different things. It's about reminders, it's about notes, it's about the way things work, the Photos app, all of that. There's a lot more overlap in those worlds than there was even just a few years ago. The other thing that I wanted to maybe circle back to a little bit is shortcuts, because one of the things you said in your review is that when shortcuts was workflow, the team's goal was inspired by things like Automator,
sure,
and to make automation accessible to everyone. And that at this point with shortcuts in iOS 13, it's eclipsed Automator. And I think that that's absolutely true, just from my perspective of having used Automator on and off for years, and then having very recently, started to explore more deeply the latest version of shortcuts. And I'll tell you, when I stopped and looked at what, for instance, James Thompson did with pCalc, and I realized what you could do with the actions donated to the system by pCalc was so much simpler than it was even just a year ago. It really clicked for me that this is now something that not only is going to be a more powerful tool for people who know it super well, like yourself, but also an incredibly good starting point for anyone who has ever been frustrated by it and hasn't been able to really quite click with how shortcuts works. I think it's a whole new ballgame in terms of bringing new users into that app.
Yeah, I think so. And you look at what Apple has done with shortcuts and the new editor and parameters, the natural language, expressive actions, and you realize how it is something so completely different from any other kind of automation that you've seen before. Maybe you're used to automation on the Mac, and you know how tools like Automator or Hazel or Keyboard Maestro represent certain concepts of automation. So the vertical flow of actions from top to bottom, that's very much a common trait of all kinds of automation tools on the Mac. The idea of assigning variables and retrieving variables and making sure that from one action to the other, you're following the correct flow of data. Apple is, in a way, undoing all of that with the new shortcuts and the idea of rather than managing this vertical flow of actions, you still put together shortcuts from top to bottom. That is still very much true, but you no longer need to carefully follow the vertical flow of data and variables between actions, because each action is now a self-contained thing thanks to parameters. So it's a very, when you talk about it, it's very hard to visualize it. And that is why I think I've done a pretty good job with the screenshots and the comparisons between iOS 12 and 13 in the review that really show you what Apple has done in redesigning the shortcuts editor. But I think the bigger point and the bigger theme is how shortcuts is not just an automation app anymore. And that was true before, but I think it's more apparent than ever in iOS 13. Shortcuts and Siri are slowly becoming the same thing, in the sense that shortcuts is effectively, at the moment with iOS 13 and third-party apps that adopt the new features, shortcuts is basically a development tool for Siri. So it's an IDE, it's a developer environment to create your own Siri customizations. You want to have a feature in Siri that is not supported by default, from Apple, you can just build your own. And especially with iOS 13.1, which I do cover in the review, despite the fact that it's coming out in 10 days, with iOS 13.1, you're going to have conversational shortcuts. And so all actions, all third-party actions and Apple-made actions that require user interaction, well, now you can have a conversation with Siri and have those actions becoming supported in a voice-only context. So you can choose from list, you can dictate text, you can choose from multiple options in a menu. So the idea would be, yes, you can still use shortcuts to put together complex custom automations. The things that I've been doing for years with workflow and shortcuts at MacStories. But really, if you take a closer look, you can start to see why Apple bought shortcuts. Not because they wanted to have a new version of Automator, but because they realized years ago, and this is a great example of how Apple can see the seed of an idea and start building upon it. They saw in shortcuts the potential for fixing Siri by putting the power in the hands of the users. And so this idea of let's use third-party developers and third-party apps and their actions sort of as a gateway for users to make their own Siri actions. And once you consider how that is true for the iPhone and the iPad, but then you're going to have shortcuts in CarPlay, and you're going to have shortcuts on the watch and on the HomePod. You have this pervasive Siri ecosystem powered by shortcuts that is so unlike anything that Apple has ever done before with AppleScript and Automator, while still having those basic automation features. It really is incredible.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, it scales. It's a scaling thing that I think is kind of unprecedented in automation. I guess I would add to it a little bit. It's a little bit like a development environment for share extensions too, because for years developers have been able to provide their own action extensions for the share sheet. And we can talk about the share sheet if you want. But now, because your shortcuts are surfaced as equal extensions to action extensions in the share sheet, you can put these together and build whatever you want to put in the share sheet in a way that just wasn't possible before if you weren't a developer.
Yeah, absolutely. And this idea of having your shortcuts available everywhere, I think it's something that Apple will continue to explore, should continue to explore. I have a brief point about this in the review. I wouldn't be surprised to see if next year, maybe you can already add shortcuts to your home screen. But what if those shortcuts could execute entirely within the context of the home screen? So for example, I have a shortcut that shows you a preview of a document or some text directly on the home screen, even more than what the widget can do. Or for example, why not have shortcuts as quick actions in files? With the new column view,
right?
You got an inspector, just like in macOS Catalina, and you have some built-in Apple-made actions like crop or rotate video. Why not have custom shortcuts in there?
Yeah, you can already do the custom shortcuts in Mac OS as it is, building them with Automator and with AppleScript and things. That would be a great addition, I think.
The shortcuts chapter is the biggest one in the review, and maybe some people are going to be surprised, like, wait, what? Shortcuts is longer than iPadOS? But that's technically not true once you consider all the other iPad features that are not part of the iPadOS chapter itself, but are part of Safari and Files, all these other apps that have iPadOS exclusive features. And I think once you consider them all, the iPad coverage is longer than shortcuts. It's just spread across the entire review.
Yeah, there's a lot in there on shortcuts, and we're actually going to do an episode next week to talk about that a little bit more and go into a little more depth about things like parameters and that sort of thing. I want to, I guess, before we get into maybe some interesting little tidbits from the review, I want to talk to you a little bit about progressive disclosure and scalability, because that's something that's really jumped out at me about the review, especially when you're talking about things like the Reminders app and the Photos app. Could you explain a little bit what you mean by that and how Apple is balancing kind of the new user versus the pro user in apps like that?
Yeah, I think Apple has learned a lesson over the past few years of how they need to balance the fact that they're shipping built-in apps to millions of users at once. And so they need to make sure that those apps at the very basic level, they can be intuitive, they can be easy to use, and they can do what users expect them to do. But also, I think Apple has learned over the past few years how to design those apps in a way that they can expose additional functionality without overcomplicating their UIs too much. And so, for example, I think Apple really became good at this with the Notes app since they relaunched Notes in iOS 9. It was really a remarkable rethinking of Notes that allowed users to keep using the Notes app like they always have. But they brought so many new features that are only revealed once you need them. They're not, the Notes app is still, you can still very much open Notes and just start typing, and you won't see menus and complicated options. They're there, but they're usually hidden behind the menu, or you need to perform a particular gesture, that kind of stuff. And over the years, they've been refining Notes, still keeping Notes simple, but adding options, so more keyboard shortcuts, or now, for example, in iOS 13, the ability to search for the contents of text inside images. So with OCR for images in Apple Notes, or sharing, first for individual notes and then for, now in iOS 13, for entire folders. So this idea of they're shipping apps to millions of users, most of them do not need advanced features. But those apps, for that other smaller portion of users, they can scale from simple needs to moderately advanced needs. And I think with Reminders, you can see another excellent example of that in iOS 13. You can still use Reminders to keep track of your groceries, to keep track of things that you gotta buy, to keep track of basic reminders like take out the trash and walk the dog. But if you wanna do more with Reminders, and if you take the time to learn Reminders and explore things like the inspector or the formatting bar, for example, you will find all of those other advanced features like image attachments and even multiple image attachments or different types of triggers and even subtasks. So you can create reminders within reminders, which is just incredible. And I think Apple is striking a good balance between having those features available, but not overcomplicating the basic UI for most people. And that is a very difficult thing to do when you're designing software, because it's so much easier, right? To just put all the controls out there, show you 10 different icons all at once, and each icon does a different thing. Like when you're using Photoshop, right? You're seeing all the controls at once. And it's so much harder to design something that looks simple, but actually is not when you're trying to do more with it.
Yeah, a couple of things that I think about that I really like in that vein are in Reminders when you type a reminder and you say, I don't know, take the dog for a walk at 3 p.m., you may just be putting that in there because you want to remind yourself at 3 p.m. to do that. But then you'll see the little suggestion at the bottom to actually apply the 3 p.m. time as the due date, which, it's not exposed to you until you try it, which is kind of a nice way to do it. And the same thing goes with notes with the OCR. You don't even have to know that's there. You just search for something. You're like, oh, here's this receipt that I scanned last week that has the word in it that I searched. It must do that. And now you've learned, a more complex feature of notes without having to actually read something about it first. It just kind of, comes to you instead of you having to go to it.
Right. Yeah.
All right, Federico, let's dive into some details because there's always things in your reviews that to me are things that I either missed when I was using the operating system over the summer, or they're things that I just bet people aren't aware of. And I don't know all
right. So let's not spoil them all.
Okay. Let's pick out a handful.
Okay. What do you want to mention?
Well, I guess I want to start maybe with, let's see. Why don't we start with the contextual menus? Because contextual menus to me, when people first see those, you long press on the screen and a contextual menu pops up. And if you're someone like myself who comes from the Mac, you might think, oh, this is like right clicking and this is the same thing. But it's a little like that, but it's not really. This is one of those areas that I think you described as Mac inspired and not necessarily copied from the Mac. What's going on there?
Yeah, a good example, I think, is files. When you show the context menu in files, so if you long press on a file or a folder, you will see all of these actions that used to belong to the copy and paste menu before in iOS 12, but that custom copy and paste menu was super hidden and kind of difficult to get to. You needed to long press, then let go, and then you would see the copy and paste menu, and you needed to navigate the copy and paste menu with the arrows on the right side and scroll through multiple options. Well, now when you long press on an item, the context menu pops up immediately, and you see a vertical list of actions displayed all at once that are clearly presented with text labels and icons based on SF symbols. And you can have support for like destructive actions. So for example, a developer can build a delete button into a context menu that looks red because it's a destructive action, and that requires a double confirmation before it actually deletes the file. And so, and other developers can have even more custom implementations of context menus. So you can have sub menus. Like if you tap on an option, it opens a secondary level of a context menu. There's a lot of freedom involved in this design. And I think context menu, yes, they are sort of similar to the contextual menus and the right click in macOS, but they are still very much designed with iOS in mind. And all the actions that used to belong to these crazy customized versions of the copy and paste menu, well, now the copy and paste menu has gone back to do what it was supposed to do years ago, which is copy and paste text. And other actions have now been rolled into context menus, which Apple has implemented throughout the entire OS. So Mail, Files, Safari, Notes, Calendar, all kinds of apps now support context menus, and they're really, really a useful and nice looking change.
Since we're talking about files, I think we should stick with that because I had no idea that you could scan right from the Files app. I thought that was still a Notes thing, which I guess it is, right? But how do you get to it?
The documents so you can tap on the ellipsis icon at the top of the Files sidebar. But not only that, but the document scanner is now an API for all kinds of apps to take advantage of. It's built into the Vision Kit framework, and all kinds of apps can now use the document scanner. In fact, I think, for example, Agenda, they're releasing version 7, and it's going to have a built-in document scanner that is the same document scanner that Apple is using in Files and Notes.
That's really interesting. And that makes so much sense for all sorts of apps. I could see other note-taking apps using that, reminders apps, all sorts of things. That's really interesting.
Yeah, the Reminders also uses the document scanner. So, yeah, it's a very nice change.
I'm just going to take a moment to mention that the iPhone 11 doesn't have USB-C, and that really bums me out.
Yeah.
Because external drives are now a thing with the iPad with USB-C, and while they also work with Lightning, it's much more limited because you need a drive that has its own power supply to do that. So that means no USB-C keys, or no USB keys in general. All that stuff is out. You have to actually have something that plugs into the wall, which is not a particularly good solution for a portable device.
Yeah, it's too bad. I am team USB-C for the iPhone as well. So fingers crossed for next year. I would love to see USB-C if only in the iPhone Pro line to start, and then maybe later trickling down into the other iPhone models. Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah, and I mean, I would like to see it in the other iPads too, but I mean, you can only wish for so much at once. So I guess exactly. I would be with you with the Pro line to start. All right, Safari has gotten so many changes, and the one that gets all the press that everybody was talking about right away was the desktop class browsing, which is a fantastic feature, but there's lots of little things in there too. And I think one of the things that I've found, as you know me, I like to have my tabs open.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I like is that you can search and switch to a tab through search now, which is just amazing. You can do this on the Mac as well, and it saves me from the situation where I've opened so many tabs that I just open another one with a tab.
Keep opening them.
Yes, with another instance of the same site and the same article or whatever it happens to be. And now instead, they're saving me from myself at least a little bit by not having the same tab open 3 or 4 times.
Yeah, and there's so many options in iOS 13 and iPadOS 13 for people like you. And I assume John Siracusa, for example, you can save entire sets of tabs.
Right.
As bookmarks all at once in a folder. This is perfect for research, like you're working on a big project and you have 25 tabs open. You can save them all as individual bookmarks in a folder. And later, you can long press on that folder and say either copy all of the URLs from each bookmark or reopen them all at once as new tabs, which I think is just amazing. Like if you're any type of user who does a lot of research on an iPad or an academic, you're working on a paper and you have a lot of different tabs to handle. Well, now you can use Safari and these tab features, and they are really, really well done. One of my favorite touches in the new desktop class Safari, John, is how for web apps that have their own keyboard shortcuts.
Oh, right.
They can override the default keyboard shortcuts of Safari. So, for example, Google Docs or Gmail, they have custom keyboard shortcuts. And if you do something like Command-Shift-L in Google Docs, which I think is used to align text to the left, it will do that. It will not trigger the same Command-Shift-L shortcut of Safari, which is supposed to show you the Safari sidebar with bookmarks and reading list. So this is the way that it's always worked in desktop web browsers, and it works the same way in iPadOS. And I think it's a really, really nice touch.
Yeah, when I got to the end of that section of your review, I really thought to myself, I need to sit down and rethink the way I browse on iOS. I really do, because I can now do that sort of saving these sets of bookmarks. And, there are sites that I literally just never go to on iOS because I know that historically they were broken. You know, you couldn't really use things very well like WordPress or Squarespace or a lot of the Google sites were just not very usable.
YouTube.
Right, YouTube. There were just a ton of them. And now a lot of them work a lot better. So I'm going to start instead of avoiding them or going to my Mac and doing that, I'm going to start checking those out and seeing what I can do on my iPad now. What else should we mention?
Something about the iPad, I think. For example, the differences between... I haven't seen enough people talk about this. The difference between primary and auxiliary windows. So, and I think personally, I mentioned this in a review, I don't think a lot of developers will actually do this, but it's something that Apple does. So you got to be mindful of the difference. Apps in iPadOS can open 2 different types of windows. Even though they sort of look the same, they behave differently. So a window can be primary or an auxiliary window. A primary window is a full-on replica of the main app. So you got the full controls, you got the full sidebar, if it's got a sidebar, all the navigation options. So you open a new Notes window, for example, as a primary window. It's going to have the sidebar. You can navigate between folders and all of that. But you can also open auxiliary windows, which are meant to show you a single piece of content in a temporary fashion. And when you're done with that piece of content, those auxiliary windows, they tend to have a button in the upper left or right corner that says done or close. And when you tap it, the window is closed. You can test this, for example, if you drag and drop an individual note, not a folder, a single note as a new window, it's going to be an auxiliary window. So it's got a button that when you tap it, it closes the window. Or I think also an individual email message from the Mail app. It's also an auxiliary window. So Apple apps do that. Developers can plug into the same system. Personally speaking, I don't necessarily like auxiliary windows because they feel like they can disappear at any moment. Even though that is not technically true, you still gotta manually dismiss them. I still feel like sometimes I drag and drop a new note and it opens as an auxiliary window. And it's fine, but then I realize, I'm done with this note, but now I kind of want to go back to the notes sidebar and open another folder, and I cannot do that because navigation is not enabled in an auxiliary window.
Yeah, it's an interesting choice. Have you seen any third parties use that yet? I was going to say I haven't either.
Quite a bit. So
yeah, absolutely. No, I haven't seen it either, and it's Notes and Mail are the two places that it's probably the most obvious. But yeah, it is strange, and especially since I think just because of the way the iPad works is where the confusion can come in. Because, on a Mac, if you're opening up a compose window or opening up an individual message, it's a separate window too, and it's not got all the functionality built into that particular window. But I don't know, I think spatially it's easier to kind of understand that that's some sort of subsidiary unit of Mail, for instance. Whereas when they're side by side in, perhaps equal sized split view windows on an iPad, they look so similar that sometimes the only distinguishing feature, especially when they're in split view, seems to be that close or that done button. And so it's easy to mistake one for one version, an auxiliary for a primary.
Yeah. And finally, I think I would like to mention the changes to screenshots in iOS 13. There's a few. You can take a full page capture. So when you take a screenshot, in some Apple apps that support it, as well as third-party apps, you will see a control at the top of the markup UI that says screenshot or full page. And when you tap the full page, for example, in Safari, you will not capture a screenshot of just what you're seeing on screen, but you will capture a PDF of the full contents of the page. And the same is true for Mail, I think. And developers can also use this API to let you save not a screenshot of the contents of the screen, but a full page view of the whole document. And MindNode, the new version of MindNode, takes advantage of this API, which is very nice. I use it a lot in Safari now. When I want to save a PDF, I no longer do the share sheet, save as PDF. I take a screenshot and then I select full page and I archive the PDF. And also you can take a screen on the iPad, you can take a screenshot with the pencil. So if you're holding the pencil and you start swiping with the pencil from either of the bottom edges of the bottom corners of the iPad Pro, you will see sort of like crosshairs animate in the middle of the screen. And if you let go of the pencil, you will take a screenshot, which is very nice. So it's like it's a very nice transition animation. I think I have a video in the review that shows it in action. So it's a very super quick way. If you're annotating, and working on the iPad Pro with the pencil, you can just swipe from the corner, let go, and you will take a screenshot.
That's really cool. And that's one of those little things that I know that I had heard about that at some point over the summer, but I'd kind of forgotten about it until I read your review. And that's the thing about Federico's review is it's all in there. So everybody should go out and read it. There's a million little tips like that, things that either you never knew were possible, or that maybe you heard it at some point over the summer, but you had forgotten about it. And it gives you, there are a lot of things, giving me a lot of ideas about new ways to use my iPad and iPhone. So that's really terrific. Federico, I think we have a lot to talk about in the coming weeks.
Yeah,
I think
like
our
it.
hands are full. I think our hands are full. And so we're going to start that next week with a shortcuts episode that goes into some of the big picture stuff and the parameters and how it's all put together and what's different with this particular version. I hope everybody has enjoyed this special bonus episode of App Stories. As I said, we'll be back next Monday, kind of back to the regular schedule. And, Federico, people can, of course, find us over on MacStories.net or at Club MacStories. Check out all the perks for the club if you're interested in that. And you can find me and Federico over on Instagram and Twitter, where Federico is at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees, JOHNVOORHWES. Talk to you Monday, Federico.
Ciao, John.